Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another episode of the WCW Monday Nitro podcast. I know it's been a while, I've just been procrastinating because, life and all. Now, today's kind of a double header because it is for the pay-per-view following the first two episodes, Fall Brawl 95, which took place on September 17th, 1995, emanating from the Asheville Civic Center in Asheville, North Carolina. Had a attendance of 6,600, more or less. And overall, it was a decent show. May have seen better, definitely have seen worse. But it was decent for what it was for the first pay-per-view following Nitro's debut. And I know that just based on what I've read for the first couple things on Nitro, that these first episodes are going to have things I like and things I don't like. And this pay-per-view kind of sums that feeling up. Let's get to it. The first match on the actual pay-per-view was Johnny B Badd defeating Brian Pillman in a number one contendership match for the United States title. It went almost 30 minutes, first 20 of which was the first part of the match. It went to a no contest, but then they restarted it, and about 9 minutes in, Johnny B Badd got the pin. Now, for these first couple matches, there's not going to be really a lot for me to say in depth because I watched this part of the pay-per-view a couple months back when I originally was going to do this, but then I procrastinated, and I decided just to continue watching the pay-per-view from where I left off. So there's only going to be some in-depth discussion on the last three matches. Craig Pittman defeated Cobra in a quick match. Nothing really much else to say about that because I don't really remember the match. DDP defeated Renegade for the TV title in about 8 minutes. This was actually the first match I actually started watching on the second time, and I have to say the most interesting thing about watching this match was that I got to see DDP when he was at the beginning of his wrestling career. And boy, what a change between there and the yo, it's me, it's DDP phase. And not to say he did improve, TV title, perfect title to win early on in his career. Renegade, what else to say that hasn't already been said? Ultimate Warrior knockoff. You could really tell that in the theme song and his mannerisms. Probably would have been better for them to get the Ultimate Warrior himself, but y'all know that Warrior was not going to be doing the J.O.B. at this point in his career. It would have been like, no. Following that, we had Harlem Heat versus Bunkhouse Buck and Dick Slater with Colonel Parker in their corner. Sherry's in the corner of Heat for the tag team titles. And Harlem Heat won. I don't have the time code written down, but it was a pretty good match. Pretty good tag title match. Probably not the best one I've seen, but for this type of pay-per-view, it was adequate. This is the first time I think I've ever seen Colonel Parker on a pay-per-view, which is fitting because since I first started this podcast, I've been listening to more of the Conrad Thompson and Tony Schiavone podcast, and they mention Parker a lot when they cover pay-per-views from this era, so it's nice to go back and watch Colonel Parker himself. And another funny thing is that I watched this match a couple days after me and my friend Alex were talking about the infamous moment involving Booker T. And, Hulk Hogan, we coming for you, bleep. And just the look on his face and just how Sherry, if you actually look at it in the high-def video, she's like, it's alright. You can tell by the look on her face, she knows. Now, the storyline going into here involving the managers is there seems to be a spark between Sherry and Colonel Parker. And before the match ends, they give into it and kiss. And this leads into the finish where Harlem Heat gets the win. And then Buck and Dick are all going to Colonel like, what? What were you? And he's like, don't worry, Hal. I'm in charge of this operation. I'll get you another tag team title match. And he's getting all foghorn leghorn like, oh, I can't believe it. All sweating and stuff in that three-piece suit of his. Definitely a character I want to look up more on as I go through this podcast and watch more of this stuff. There's decent spots and continues that love angle. So overall, it's a match that has a good spot on the card. Decent. Next, we get what I feel is the best overall match from both an in-ring standpoint and a story psychological standpoint on the entire card. And that is the dissolution of the Four Horsemen, Arn Anderson versus Ric Flair. And Arn Anderson comes out on top, which I did not see coming, because, those of you who don't know, I did not grow up watching wrestling in the Monday Night Wars. I was aware of it. I played with action figures. I played some of the video games with my friend Joey later on in the war, but I did not start watching wrestling itself until after the war, which in retrospect I smacked myself for. Is like, if I had started watching at least in 2000, granted I would have seen the war when it was all WWE and WCW was just chugging along until their ultimate death. But it would have been something. I could at least still say, yep, I was there at the ass end of it. But nope, I did not get there until it was WWE trying to recreate that magic with the first brand extension. But, you know, that's another topic, another day. Now, here, watching this match, they built it up well. They had Arn Anderson cut a promo before, which you could tell there's a lot of emotion in there. And from what I've read, apparently after he finished the promo in the cut camera, he vomited. Which, with how into the promo Arn was when he is on camera, I believe it. It's actually a question I'd like to ask Arn in person if I ever got the chance to meet him. It's like, Arn, did you really vomit? You know, maybe that'd be one of those things if, I have to check to see if Conrad and Tony have covered this pay-per-view, and if not, when they do get around to it, I will ask the question. Before the match starts, a lot of wrestlers come out to watch it from the stands. We got Flying Brian, we got the American males, even Colonel Parker comes back out. He's cooled himself down a little bit since his boys' match. Tony and Bobby, you know, during this whole pay-per-view, it was fun to hear them on commentary, especially Bobby's one-liner. But this is the match where they really sell it. They really sell the story and history between the two in the match as it's going on. Like, there's one point where Arn does a spot to basically disable one of Rick's arms, and the look on Rick's face, like, really, after all we've been through, you're going to do that to me? And it's a technical brawl if you want to place anything on it. There's some technical wrestling, there's a little bit of brawling, but the thing that really makes this match work is the psychology, and a lot of it is connected to the history that these two individuals have. And it's why this story works. It's why a personal story like this in professional wrestling always works, for the most part. And these two were great in-ring workers when they were in their primes, and they still were later on, but this is, I think Arn only had about a year and a half left in his career, and Rick still had about a decade left, so, you know, they were, you know, one's almost on his way out, and the other one still had a ways to go, but this is, I think, where you could say they're still at their peak. And they told a very great story in this match. And Tony, I think it was Tony who said it. It could have been Bobby. I forget which one. But I'm saying it's probably Tony. Said at one point in the match, this is WCW. And even though I haven't seen a lot of WCW matches, I will have to agree with him. This match epitomizes what made WCW great when they were great. And also there's a double meaning there, is that these two were some of the heart and soul of WCW, so to see them going at it in a great match like this helps sums the company up. At one point near the end, Flair blocks a DDT attempt from Arn Anderson using the ropes, which of course he eventually does do the Flair flop afterward. It's like, okay, that's a little funny. And then the figure four gets reversed at one point, which, you know, this happens in a lot of Flair matches where he puts the figure four on, it's reversed, and he breaks the hold, which led to the little joke that people have told throughout the years that, when is Flair ever going to win a match with a figure four? Remember that, it's going to become important in just a little bit. Near the end, Flying Brian comes out to the ring, gets on the ring apron, and starts having a little back and forth discussion with Flair. There's a little punching thing. Flair turns around, Brian lifts his leg and kicks him in the back of the head, which leads to him getting DDT'd by Arn and pinned, which gets massive heel heat since they're down in the heart of WCW. Now, the fans, I don't know if they're booing because Arn won or booing because of how the victory came. I lean more towards that second one. And just looking at the look on some of the faces of the fans that they show at ringside, it seems that seems to be the case more. But it's like, oh, Brian, you do not know what can of worms you just opened. You're going to mess with the Nature Boy, Ric Flair? You're going to get chopped to hell, boy. Now we come to the main event, and boy, what is there to say about this match? This is the first WarGames match I've watched, and I have to say it's probably not the best one to start with. It is the Hulkamaniacs, led by Hogan, and it's comprised of Savage, Lex, and Sting, versus the Dungeon of Doom, managed by the Taskmaster, Kevin Sullivan, and boy. The cheesy promo that starts the lead up to this match sets the tone for it. It is something straight out of the 80s that should have stayed in the 80s, but if you know anything about WCW when it comes to Hulk Hogan after he debuted, They were trying to recreate the magic of his heyday, and it just didn't work. Some things should stay in the 80s. Sometimes you can recreate it. Hogan's thing, to a point, it worked, but when I went to this feud, just even looking at it in retrospect, it's like, how did they think this was a good idea? I can only imagine the WCW home fans groaning when they saw this and like, oh, he's trying to bring this down. And as you can expect, Hogan's team wins in the end. And because of this, he gets 5 minutes with the Taskmaster, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. Hogan's team is in camo with face paint, and Hogan starts it off with his typical Hogan promo, you know something, Mean Gene? We're going to defeat the bad guys. Because their heels were the faces, brother. Now, there's one line he says in this that just got me blinking a little bit, mainly because of what it is. And if you know anything about world history, especially U.S. history when it comes to war, you'll know what it is, and that was something about drinking Agent Orange. I'm like, okay, I get where he's coming from with this. It's just a weird line to use. You're going to drink Agent Orange? I wonder what those who were exposed to Agent Orange thought of when they heard that line, if any of them watched this pay-per-view. Now, at the end, when Hogan finally has his moment with the Taskmaster where he's whooping his butt, who comes out but the Giant? He injures Hogan with something that's supposed to be a neck break, and then, Lex, Sting, and Savage come out to aid him, and they chase the Giant off, and that's how the pay-per-view goes off the air, which, like I said, overall was an okay pay-per-view. If it had ended with the Flair-Arn match, probably would be a couple points higher, but with that ending, smells of Hogan's creative control and trying to recreate the 80s. Definitely with the whole Hogan injury thing, this kind of reminds me of when he got squished by Earthquake, but I have a feeling they're not going to sell it as long as that. Now, on the following episode of Nitro, they're selling it, like the announcers mentioned several times, that this Saturday on WCW Saturday Night, 6:05, they're going to get an update on Hogan's medical condition. And like a usual Fallout show, they show footage from the pay-per-view to show what happened, but they also show some footage that I don't remember them showing on the pay-per-view, and that is the Giant running over Hogan's bike. Which, that would have been nice to see on the actual pay-per-view if it wasn't there, but that's WCW management, if I can even talk, for you. As this episode of Nitro begins, the Taskmaster and Giant enter the back in an ambulance, and Giant cuts a promo basically saying, I am the one true immortal. And this makes me think, watching Giant speak, it makes me think of something that Bruce Pritchard said in a podcast that they did not that long ago, and that is that when Big Show / Giant first came to WWE, they had to really get him out of his Hogan promo mindset, being that he was trying to emulate Hogan. I did not know what he meant, but now watching Giant cut a promo in WCW, I get what he means. Especially this early in his career. It's like, he's like a giant one. And of course, this is when he was still Andre the Giant's kayfabe son, so they have Mean Gene saying a line like, your father would be very disappointed. I don't think his father would be disappointed. I mean, his father's the guy that turned heel on Hulk Hogan in '87 by aligning himself with Bobby Heenan. I don't think he would be disappointed. He'd be like, you take title from Hogan. Take it. Now, the first match is going to be the American Males, and they were originally going to wrestle the Blue Bloods, but Harlem Heat takes the Blue Bloods out and makes a promo, which leads to an impromptu title match. Now, as the announcers mentioned, they don't know if this is going to be sanctioned or not because the authority figure is not there, but they're just going to go with it. As Eric says, this is as live as it gets. And Heat dominates the match for the most part. The Males do get some offense in, but it's quickly cut off. But the Males get a surprise pin in near the end after Colonel Parker comes out, and he makes off, and he makes out with Sherry. And as I said, it's unsanctioned, so we're going to have to wait and see if this victory is going to be official or not. And I did not check the record books to make sure if it was or not, so I'm going to be like the audience when I watch the next episode. I'm going to be surprised. Next, Mean Gene Okerlund interviews Flair talking about the night before, and as he says to Arn, you broke the code. You brought in an outsider. And after this, he threatens Bryan and Arn, saying they're both going to pay. Bryan especially, since he's the one that interfered, and they're going to be wrestling in the main event. And Arn, he wants a piece of, because he suspects that Arn told Bryan to come out. Now, whether or not that's the case, or Bryan just interfered on his own because he had some past business to deal with Flair, I'm going to find out, but I have a feeling it might end up being that Arn did, but considering that Arn and Flair got back together later, it could not be. But then again, in wrestling, a lot of times they'll make partners get back together for one reason or another. Happened with Kane and The Undertaker multiple times. Happened with Shawn Michaels and Triple H. So there is a precedent for it, even though those ones happened later. But I think you get where I'm coming from with this. Next, we got a filler match of Mr. Wonderful, Paul Orndorff versus Johnny B. Badd. It was a decent match for what it was, and interrupted by the commercial break. The announcers were roasting Paul's theme as he came out, saying, "Is that really a woman or is that an alien? Is that a machine?" Which I get it. I mean, it's not the best wrestling theme, but it fits the Mr. Wonderful character, especially if you're going to try to make him a heel. It's kind of hard to tell if he's supposed to be a heel here or not. I'll find out later. Paul reversed the pile driver attempt on Badd's part, and it eventually went into a pin, and Mr. Wonderful walks out with a victory. Nothing much else to say about that. Then we got footage of Macho Man when we came back from the commercial break, where he's lifted on a beach during the shooting of the episode of Baywatch that featured the wrestlers, which didn't debut until the following year. And it shows Taskmaster attacking Macho Man when he's in the middle of a lifting set when he's benching, and Flair comes in to help him, like, "What are you doing?" Macho Man basically shuns him off, and as he says in an interview with Mean Gene in the middle of the ring, "Thanks, but no thanks." And then he tells Taskmaster that he's going to destroy him, that "you're either with me or you're against me." And then he starts talking about Lex's supposed cheap shot the night before at the pay-per-view, which brings out Lex, and they get into a back-and-forth argument, which eventually is punctuated by this line from the Macho Man: "You want to play with the big boys, eh? Well, there's none bigger than the Macho Man Randy Savage." And apparently off-screen, they got into a little tussle that had to be broken up by security. Why they didn't show that, I don't know. Maybe they thought it was better to actually not show it, to just tell them that they touched so that we, the audience, would want to see them. But you would think they would at least show footage of it after they came back to fill a little bit of time, but WCW. This is where we got the footage of the Giant running over Hogan's motorcycle, but I've already talked about it. And our main event, Flying Brian versus Flair, and it was a pretty good TV main event match. I mean, it was back and forth. You could tell by Flair taking it to Brian right away that this was a very personal match for him. Not in the same way as Arn and him had the night before, but in a way like, "Oh, you messed with my match? I'm going to kick your ass." And he takes it right to Brian at the beginning. He gets him to the barricade and starts chopping the crap out of him like he promised earlier. And of course, Flair wins the match with the figure 4. Something I mentioned before you rarely see out of him, but he won with the figure 4. I have to applaud that. He won with the figure 4. And of course, after this, he calls out Arn, but Arn doesn't come out. But Flair says, "Next week." Then we got a little cutback after the commercial, but that's literally the end of the show. And once again, it's another decent episode of Nitro. Based on the synopsis of the next couple episodes, they're probably going to be episodes I like a few things about, but as a whole I find lacking. But let's see how that is. I think that's going to be my thoughts for the most part until I get to the most infamous heel turn in wrestling history. But that's a while away.